Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for stopping by to watch another Jacob Misick Coreldraw tips tutorial. This one will be a 5 awesome tips for Coreldraw. This is just part 1. In today's tutorial, we're going to discuss how to make objects with shaping. Shaping is a tool within Coreldraw. When you select multiple objects, you get the shape tools at the very top. You can do that by selecting one object, then selecting a second object, and you'll notice up at the top you'll have these shaping tools. Also, alternatively, you can also go to the Shape Docker window, which is the more older way of using such tools. Go to Window, Dockers, and then under Dockers, go to Shape. For today's tutorial, we're just going to go over some of the simple shapes and then show off some other shapes that I've created just using some of these tools. Let's start with the first one. I'm going to click these two little objects here that I already have set up, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Weld. This takes exactly the two objects and welds them together. Sometimes the objects are not exactly quite perfect. You'll notice there'll be extra nodes when you do this. And in those particular cases, you're just going to want to remove those nodes. You can do that by going to the shape tool like we discussed in the last tutorial and just selecting the extra nodes that you may have. For example, let's say this is the node here. You would select that node, and then hit the delete key on your keyboard, and that node would be gone. So then you would just have the corner nodes. You wouldn't have multiple nodes inside of that. Sometimes when you have objects welded, there'll be some very strange kind of ways that they'll merge together. I don't know if I can get it to do it on the fly. However, in those particular cases, just use your better judgment. The less nodes that you have, the easier it is. It won't try its hardest to put those two objects together. But in some cases, you may have some redrawing issues. You may have to finesse the actual object itself. But for the most part, it does a fairly decent job in welding the two together. All of these have that same kind of issue, but in different ways. There may be issues where, like for instance in this next example, when I select two objects and I hit the subtract option, what that does is it subtracts the top one, or trim, excuse me. If you subtract one from the other, you get this absent, this cut into the square below. And in most cases that doesn't necessarily have too many issues when it's squares, but when you're talking about intricate objects, sometimes the objects don't quite cut right. So using your better judgment in some cases is necessary. However, in most cases, you don't really worry about it. You'll come across them, and you'll know what I mean when you see them. All right, so we've gone through the trim and we've gone through the weld. Let's go through the next one. So I'm going to select the bottom one, select the top one. It doesn't necessarily really matter which one you choose, first or second, but in some programs it will. In Coreldraw, it's actually order priority. So this object is in front of the orange object, and so therefore that is the main object if it needs a main object. So like in Trim's example, you will need a main object, and that's the one that's on the top. In Intersect, however, I believe the only thing that really will do is the color below is the color selected or chosen, or the object properties are the ones that are selected. So if I move this one over, this is the intersect of those two devices. You'll notice there's this kind of invisible orange square, but if I change the color, you'll notice it was the place where this was right on top. So it's the intersect between those two objects that makes this object. This can be helpful for things like when you want to make a shadow in a certain area. You would just draw in those specific places and you can make a quick intersect. In this particular case, what I'm going to do to just make sure that we recognize this as intersect, I'm going to make invisible by using the transparency, but give an outline, so it just gives us an idea as to what it looks like when it's all kind of complete. And that helps us to remember that that's the intersect. just very much like the icon that's showing here. Next, we have the simplify option. So simplify is a little bit different. Simplify actually is an actual, it's whichever one is selected first, which object is selected first is what it's going to trim into. So if you had multiple objects selected, the one that's on the top is the one that is going to make the selection. So for example, let's just take this for example. If I select this object first and then select this object and then hit simplify, you'll notice that it cuts into that object. However, let's go back a few steps. Let's do the same thing, but in this case, I'm going to select the back first and then the top. And you'll notice that when I hit simplify, it's still selecting or deleting the bottom from the top. So it's always whichever one is on top is the one that is the selection. Where trim, I'm sorry I told you wrong, the trim is the actual one that is whichever one you select first is the one that is doing the trimming. So if I select the bottom first and then the top and then hit trim, you'll notice it cut out the blue square instead of the orange object here. So, okay, so that's just a little bit of a difference between the two. However, they do very similar functions. I'm going to drag this over here. Let's go back. There we go. Alright, so the next tool here is the front minus back. This does exactly what you expect it to do. If I select this one, front minus the back, and I select the front minus back, you'll notice it takes the front and subtracts the back. So it's very similar to the trim tool and the simplify tool. It's just it's giving you exactly what it does, which is the front is subtracted, is the back subtracts from the front. So it does exactly what it's supposed to do. That it's a similar trim kind of function. Some cases you may want to do that. Alright, so we're going to select the next section, and this one is the back minus front. As obvious, I don't necessarily know why you would have the back minus front since you have the trim option. I usually just use the trim option. I don't use the front minus back and back minus front, but it's a feature. I need to make sure to show these tools. So there it is right there. You'll also notice that when you do the front minus back and the back minus front, you'll notice that the other square disappears completely, and that's because that's no longer a viable object because you're subtracting one from the other. It's not keeping those objects. The final one is actually one of my more favorite ones, and this is the create boundary. This is very useful. The reason being is because when you select the create boundary, it makes a boundary around the two objects and welds it together. This is helpful for when you want to make like a line weight around your object. So for example, I have this object here that I just created, right? I'm just going to Control Z so that it's exactly, straight and to the point around my object. If I hit F12 on my keyboard, you'll notice that there's a series of options here. These are all the outline options for your pen. Now some of these options are also up the top here. However, this gives you more kind of features to be able to get to at a glance. So I usually use F12 versus over the top, unless it's just a line weight that I wanted to deal with. This is very helpful because, like I said, here's your line widths. There's all kinds of options that are already set as a default. I'm just going to choose 4, just as an example, and as you notice, it's already showing in this kind of preview here. I'm going to go to rounded corners. I'm going to go to the rounded lines. That helps for when you have points or nodes. Those nodes are also rounded, and in some cases you might want that. Then there's the position. This is the outside line, the center of the line, and then the inside of the line. I want to do the outline. And the reason why is because I want this nice thick line around the outside, and I don't want it to affect the two colors within the inside. Alright, and the last thing I'm going to choose is I'm going to choose behind fill. This just makes it so that if my fill in the two squares were to go over, it basically puts that black line behind that. So I'm going to hit OK, and you'll notice that I have this nice, crisp, thick, dark line, but I also have this the two squares, right? And the two squares have just this nice contrast between the two. Now, the reason why I would do something like this, and typically when I'm doing cartoons or I'm doing illustrations, what I would do is I would actually have like a specific object. For example, I'm just going to select this one object, and I would put a black line around this, right? But I would have a less thicker line around that one object. So, like for instance, I would go 1.0. Oops, I have the wrong thing selected here. Let me just select the right thing. Yep. All right, so I'm going to go page down on this. That's going to put it, shift page down is going to put it behind all these two objects, right? And so then I'm going to select the orange square, and I'll choose right click the black, and there's an outline here that you really can't see too well. There is a black line there. I'm going to change that line weight. I'm going to go from 5 to, we'll say 2. And it doesn't really show too much, but that's because the blue's in front, so I'm going to send the blue to the back. And then you'll notice that there's a fairly nice thick line here. We're still getting kind of this inconsistent result, and that is the reason why, is because that's on behind fill, or behind, what do you call it, inside line. I'm going to hit F12, and it's actually, I'm sorry, set to centered line. I apologize. I'm going to go to outside line. I'm going to do the same circle, and I'm going to do rounded corners because I like rounded corners. And there we go. So we have a 2.0, right? Or a 2 line weight, but 4 on the outside. So it makes this kind of nice, like it's got a nice thick outline that kind of makes this emphasis on the object, but then there's this thinner line on the inside to kind of add a nice detail. There are some other ideas that you could use this for example, not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but if you were to do line style, you could give it like a marching ant line, right? So that way it has this kind of implied line, but it's not, it's not overpowering the object. You could also change its color, right? That would be the other way of doing it, so like a yellow line, right? So there's all kinds of nice little features with this, and this is just kind of a smaller example of some of the things that you can do with shape tools. Now I'd like to give a little bit more of kind of like some examples. So I found some objects or some references to what I've done before to use this tool to make shapes. So for example, here's this skull. This was an object that I had created at one point, and I used specific parts of the outline that I had created, this white line right here. It's hard to see in this one. This is an outline of just of all the objects, just copied and pasted and just showing just the lines themselves. So you'll notice that this object here has this very similar shape to the edge of the face, or the edge of the skull. And the reason being is because what I did was I just took my freehand tool, for example, and I just traced an object, or traced a line around that area in which I wanted the lighter space, completed the line by going to the end of it and hitting it, letting it go to that little arrow that looks like an enter or carriage return. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the pick tool, and now that I have the pick tool, I can select the skull. Oop, didn't select the skull. Let's try that again. There we go. Let's just make sure I got the right thing here. Right click. Yeah, I got the skull. Just making sure. Alright, so, and how I did that was I just right clicked to the color, and that just basically changed the color of the object that I had selected. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to select we're going to select the outline first, the object that I made, and then I'm going to select the skull, and then I'm going to choose intersect, right? So now I have that particular space already set up as an intersected piece. So that allows me to, well actually that's not even the right one. Selected the wrong object the first time. So let's try that again. Alright, so let's go back. I'm going to select this. Let's just make sure we have the right objects. We do. There we go. See, you can see this is the outline, the outer outline, and this is the object that I made. And then when I intersect the two together, and I select this one off, delete it, it cuts to the contour of that skull. And so this could be used as a light and shadow. It could be used as a dark space. It could be used as a light space, like I did in here. It's very versatile because it just allows me to create a shadow quickly, and I don't have to mess around with trying to make sure that all my node points are in the right area. So I might go around and, for instance, clean up some of these nodes just because they're not quite hitting the face the way in which I want to. And then I would just do this for, you know, light and darkness. And in some cases, that's how I deal with my light and darkness, is that I just get an overall trace as to where I want it, kind of refine one edge, but not worry about the other, because the intersect will take care of outlining that area. So that's kind of a nice little feature there. So I'm going to hit delete on that. So that's how this skull was kind of created. Like, for instance, this outer ring here is actually a trim. It was just this purple area, and the inside was just basically expanded. And then what I did was I trimmed this outer edge from the bigger blue circle. And so I was able to create this shape by just using the same object and duplicating it. Same thing with the nose. That's how I was able to make that kind of look of a cavity within inside the eye socket and within the nose cavity there. Also, I use it within making shapes for for cartoon characters or for animals, illustrations and whatnot. So, for instance, this is its own object of like a shape of the face. That was a easy, quick fill, right? I didn't really have to do too much to that. That was just basically two big gigantic ovals that were put over the top of a circle, and then I intersected the two, right? Same thing here on the ears. This is just nothing more than a big gigantic oval in the background. But what I could do is I could actually select the circle of the entire face, right? That's this one. And then what I could do is select the ears. And then what I could do is come up here to trim, and that would trim out all that space around those ears, right? So it's just the ears. And then also you'll notice that, again, like I said before, the last tool was my favorite, where it makes the object around it, or by making this object here and this object here, making it create boundary, I'm able to make this space behind it. So what I would do in that particular case is I would select the main circle, select the ear circle, and I would duplicate it by clicking and dragging the two objects, and then right-clicking, which basically makes a duplicate, like we talked about in the first video. And then what I would do is I would just come up here to create boundary, and it makes a boundary around that particular, those two objects. It combines them together and just makes the boundary, right? So now if I select this one, there's that object, right? And then I can just delete these two, or I could just weld them together and do the same thing. Now, since we're on the object or subject of welding, let's talk about that real quick. I'm going to go back a couple steps. There are ways that we used to do this in the older versions of Coreldraw. So you may not have the option of the boundary option. So how do you create a bounding object? Fairly easy. You just click on the Weld tool instead. You'll notice that when you do this, you may, like we were talking about before, you may have extra nodes, and in those particular cases, you're going to have to remove all the extra nodes. I just go in and just kind of, delete the ones I don't need. I don't really spend too much time worrying about, that. So we'll do that real quick. There we go. And I'm going to select that one, delete that one. And then the same thing over here. I'm just going to select and delete these and delete this one. Okay, so it looks pretty good, right? There's just a little bit of a kind of a funny little shape there. The left side looks like it's kind of pushed up a little bit more than the right side, so I may take my time to just make sure that that looks a little bit more straight. However, it doesn't look too terrible, so I'm not going to worry about it for this particular example. And then I'm going to come up here, excuse me, to Object. Oh, I'm sorry, I got to outline it first. So I'm going to choose a color. We're going to do the F12 thing again. We're going to go in and I'm going to change my line point to, let's say, 3. And we'll do the round and outside position behind fill. Okay, so there we go, right? So now what I'm going to do is come up here to Object, go to Convert Outline to Object, and when I deselect off of this and then select back on, you'll notice that there's the outline. I can delete this, and here's the outline. Pretty nifty, pretty helpful too, because then you can just basically put this over the top of this. Now there also may be times where you're still going to want to do this, because what this does is it creates this basically double line, a line within a line. Now there are ways that you could achieve this same goal by combining, and I'm going to talk about that just briefly real quick. If I were to select or make an object like a circle, right, and I were to make a second circle, actually let's do this a different way. I'm going to go back a step. We're going to take this main circle here, and I'm going to hold shift, and I'm going to right click like we normally do to make a duplicate object, right? So now I have this circle and this circle, but let's just kind of give this some context. I'm going to make this circle red and this circle yellow, okay? So now these are two separate objects. One object is on top of the other. So how do I make this like this, where it's just an outline? Easy peasy. Just click on the little red circle, click on the yellow circle by holding shift like we did before, and then come up here to combine, and you combine the two together. So now it's one object when you do a combine. Combine can be really tricky. You'll find situations where when you put two things on top of each other, it combines it in unique ways where it will cut into one object but not into the other, or it will do some kind of strange kind of geometry, it looks like. However, I assure you that's not, that's because of how it's been set. I'll give you an example. Let's break this apart real quick. I'm going to show you how to do that too. So I have these two circles, and I hit this button over here, or excuse me, I have this one object, and if I click this break apart button right here, or hit Control K, what will happen is it'll go back to revert back to the way that they were before. Now the only difference is this one's on top, no big deal, just hold shift, page down, right? It's at the bottom now. And then you have this second shape here, it no longer has the color before, so you'd have to change the color back to what it was before, because it doesn't keep that information when it combines the two objects together. Now if I were to take that object and I were to just push it off to the side a little bit, and let's just make a second one. So I'll click and drag and hold shift, and there we go. So now we have these three shapes, right? So if I combine this, it's going to do some funky geometry. See what I'm talking about with the funky geometry? That's because this circle overlaps the other circle, which overlaps this one. But technically this is not incorrect. This is what we've told it to do, because when you combine objects, it subtracts one from the other, then subtracts, then does the inverse of the other, right? Because it just basically is like a set of inception. It goes through the object multiple times, and it basically just keeps calculating what you've already asked it to do. A more easier way to understand this is if I were to break this apart, bring this back to the back, right? And then I select this object, move this object to the middle, take this object, move this to the middle. And then I'm going to select, I'm going to select the front one here, and we'll just make this one smaller. It doesn't have to be perfect. This is just an example, right? So now I have these three objects over top of each other. If I select this pick tool and I just drag over the top and hit combine, you'll notice that it goes circle closed in and shaded, circle closed in on the outside, shaded, but there's this cut on the inside, and that's because that's how the combine sets them together. So these are all of these tools for the Weld tools are very helpful for these particular situations. There will be times where you'll want to be able to make these objects because, like for instance, the outline, for example, let's say you want to make a nice kind of color around an object, like we did for, let's say, for example, this dog kind of character here. If I were to select this object, wrong object, let me select that again. If I were to select this object here, which is that circle, right at this moment it's set to line weight, so I gotta make this into a shape. So I'm gonna come up here to effects, or I'm sorry, object, excuse me, and then convert outline to object, right? So now it's that same object that we just had, it's just a little bit different, right? So that looks pretty good, but we want to make that object, we're going to move this down just a little bit, like that. Okay, we want to make this object a different color so that it kind of fades into his dark of his ears, around his ears, but on the top of his head and on the bottom of his head we want it different colors, right? We want the top of his head to be lighter and the bottom of his head to be darker with the outline, right? That's an easy way to fix that. We just add a gradient. So I'm going to go to Interactive Fill Tool, and I'm just going to drag this from top to bottom, and when I do that, it's going to make this kind of gradation from brown to white, which is really nice because then we can take multiple colors. So I'm going to choose a different color. I'll choose this darker brown here from the Coreldraw color palette, and then I'm going to choose a different color in this middle section. I'm going to click my eyedropper tool, the color eyedropper tool. I'm going to select that color. So now I've got that color selected, and I'm going to need to put that in an object. No. Actually, when I select that color, add to palette. That's what I'm going to do. Document palette. So now it should be within my color selections. The Docker palette is this one here. So it should be this one here, I believe. Alright, so we're going to try that out real quick. So I'm going to go to the Interactive Fill tool once more. You'll notice that there's a slider here at the bottom. I can slide this up, which will change the gradient from dark to light very quickly, or I could go the other way so that it's light almost all the way through and then just darker at the bottom. Or if I wanted to add another color, for example, I can just click and drag this on, and you'll notice it makes this separate color, which is nice. I can add as many colors as I want. I can also select a color, hit the delete key, and we'll remove it. I'm going to try to see if I can find that one color that is, yeah, it's that one. Okay, so then I'm going to drag that into here, and you'll notice that now it's the same color as the ears, but I might want to add two of them so that it goes from the top of the ear to the bottom of the ear. So you'll notice that the color starts to appear at the very, very top, and it starts to disappear at the very, very bottom of the ears, right? So, and the nice thing about this is I can drag this any way, shape, or form. And then I also have this option, which changes kind of more of the gradation angle, but I'm going to leave it as is for right at this moment. We won't worry about that for this particular case. So that's just to kind of give an example of some of the things that you could do with shaping. I kind of went over briefly a little bit about gradients within this tutorial. So to kind of give you an example as other things that I've done with this, we'll use this real quick. I'll just give you a couple quick examples. This is this is a character I've created. It's a flame character, P-H-L-A-M-E. Bad joke. But anyways, I used it to create these. I used the shape tools to create these objects within the shape of the character. For example, you'll notice that there's a little bit of a shading here off to the side of his head. This is a gradation, right? It's also got a transparency on it. We'll go on that. We'll talk about that in another tutorial, of course. Some other techniques that I've used over time. There's also this shape, which is the shape of his belly, to kind of give it a little bit lighter color. That's helpful. And then there's also this color here, which is just another like shade, but it's also another object. So it was just cut out of the outside of the inside of the this flaming hand here, right? Same kind of thing here. This is an object that was created by just basically making an object within inside of an object and then doing an intersect. So those are some pretty good examples of where I've used that tool. Also, there's a thickness around the entire thing. You'll notice that it's a little bit darker around the entire edge, and that's because in most cases I usually like that darker edge around the edge. You'll notice that he just looks like he's missing something when he's just by himself. It's not necessarily bad that way, but I really think that he looks better that way. So that's just a matter of preference, really. That's just how I like it. I don't know how to explain it. That's just it's my kind of thinking. Something I found from another artist that I found was very interesting is his line weights were always varied within his graphics, and that was something that I just kind of carried over into my own artwork. Find the things that make you interesting and use those as your vernacular to make your artwork. But again, kind of a different conversation for another video about those kinds of things. If you're interested, just leave me a comment down in the comment section. We'll talk about that and possibly make a video out of that. I think that's a very interesting topic. I think we should talk about Coreldraw is a wonderful program. There's all kinds of great things you can do with it. The thing that most of these vector art programs can't teach you is your unique style and taste. You learn all the technical about the programs themselves, but you still have to put your own unique flavor on your art. So that's just my matter of a preference, or my personal opinion, if you will. But yeah, if you really want to go into that, not a problem. I'll make a video and we'll talk about that. So this was another character I'd created at the time in college. I kind of felt like people were sheeple. At the time it was just kind of more of a joke. And it was a good character. I felt like it really kind of felt kind of zombie-ish, and the colors, the grayscale was kind of based on that same kind of mundane drone kind of feel. So these were some of the things that I was thinking about when I was drawing this, and I was interested in how shapes kind of light and shadow kind of make these shapes. So I was playing around with that idea and kind of put that in my artwork. And also again with the line thickness, it's different varying line thicknesses. You'll notice that there's this particular object within the ear where it doesn't quite match up right. You'll notice there's a little bit of white space. I was playing around with that idea, but I think overall it works pretty nice. I think it has a nice feel to it. So those are the two main characters I wanted to show to you to kind of give you an idea as to what I use the shape tools for. Here's another. Let's ungroup this real quick. Ungroup. There we go. Okay, here's another example right here in his kind of britches, where these digigrade legs, right, and in this middle part, right there. There we go. There we go. Okay, so I've selected the area where it's shadowed. I actually took that object and just cut it into the space, right? So you'll notice that's what it looked like before, and I kind of wanted to give it a little bit, unique texture. And so what I did was I just basically traced out that area, and then once the area was traced out, then I just used the intersect to give me that object there. Same kind of thing on the outside here. You'll notice there's a little bit of white showing up. I wanted that because I figure, lighting, usually when you're talking about how lighting and shadow works, there's usually this kind of residual edge that's a little bit brighter than the darker inside shadow. So I just wanted to kind of show that, and it kind of gives it a unique flair, if you will. So that's pretty much it for this particular tutorial. If you have any questions, comments, complaints, concerns, have some ideas for things you'd like to see in the next tutorials, let me know. My next tutorial will be within this week. I will be discussing textures are awesome, talking about the textures within Coreldraw. Things to come are power clips and how we can use power clips to do all kinds of wonderful, great things, and some things about making shapes, 3D shapes in 2D, using Coreldraw to make these 3D objects. Thank you very much for watching and taking your time. I appreciate you guys watching me and just being a part of this journey that I take here on YouTube, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.